A cool breeze meets her face as she begins to evaluate the contents of her world-famous matte black fridge. She kept the refrigerator full. That was something she promised herself even as a teenager. Her mother's fridge had often been near empty, just some milk, sometimes a stick of butter, other times not. But now, as Kris Jenner stood in her own kitchen years later, reaching for a water after a busy Sunday with her large intergenerational family, a wave of contentment hits her and a quiet smile begins to lift her face. She'd come a long way from her childhood apartment in Claremont, from those long afternoons waiting for her mum to come home from work, and still, in the depths of her memory, she could just about feel the ache of that hunger and the silence of an empty kitchen. As she closes the fridge and walks across the white wood floor to her pristine kitchen island, a candle flickers in the distance. Notes of vanilla and tobacco intermittently rise and fall as she picks up her iPhone, texting her daughters, "Dinner was gorgeous. Thanks for coming, girls." She looks up momentarily, reveling in the grandeur of it all. The vanilla picks up in intensity and begins to fall as the tobacco positions itself underneath to steady its landing. Kris, with her eyes closed, takes a deep breath. The quiet smile resumes for a few short moments. Within a flash, the time for reflection is up. Let's get back to business. Welcome to the Sleepy Archives, a safe space where you can relax in the company of gentle storytelling. Tonight, we settle into the life of Kris Jenner, a story that might seem loud from the outside, but beneath the noise is something more textured. A life shaped by longing, by sharp turns and harder lessons. A woman who became a manager, a mother, a matriarch, and somewhere along the way, a master of modern fame. In this podcast, we will be referring to Caitlyn Jenner before her transition as her previous name, Bruce. Before we get back to our story, this podcast can also be enjoyed at a slower playback speed for further relaxation. If you enjoy these episodes, please consider leaving us a like, comment, and follow on whatever platform you're listening on. And with that, let's begin. Kris Jenner was born Kristen Mary Houghton on November 5th, 1955, in San Diego, California. The name wouldn't ring out across magazine covers for another 50 years, but even then, there was something in her, a flicker of resourcefulness, a quiet sense of watching and learning that bedazzled those who crossed her path. Kris Jenner's parents were the product of the post-Depression era. As a result, a hard work ethic was instilled in the minds and the souls of both from an early age. Her mother, Mary Jo M.J. Campbell, was born on the 26th of July, 1934, in Arkansas, though she spent much of her young life in Southern California. Her family background was modest and rooted in practicality. The cultural climate of the time shaped her early years, a time of resilience and traditional values. MJ grew up in a home that prized self-reliance. As a young woman, MJ was drawn to beauty. In the 1950s, she attended a local beauty college in Southern California to become a beautician, a profession that combined her eye for detail with a growing sense of independence. She had elegance about her, the sort of lady who always had pristine nails, a signature scent, and who understood the power appearance can hold. But MJ wasn't just aesthetically composed. She was clever and capable, with a streak of quiet grit beneath the surface. She was also socially savvy, someone who acknowledged people, who could read a room and knew how to generate collective momentum. Robert True Houghton, Kris's father, was born on the 12th of May, 1931, in San Diego, California. His early years were dictated by structure. Robert's father had served in the military, and the family upheld this discipline in their home life. Robert had a knack for mechanics and engineering from a young age. He was logical, precise. As he grew older, he studied engineering, eventually becoming an aerospace engineer, working in an industry that became central to California's economy during the Cold War era. While Robert was undeniably bright, his personal life was more complex. He was handsome, charismatic, but also temperamental. There are accounts of him struggling with alcoholism, and later in life, Kris would speak about the volatility she experienced in her early childhood. In the early 50s, MJ Campbell was working as a young beautician in San Diego, saving up for her own car and enjoying the limited independence women of her generation could afford. She was just 20 when she met her future husband, who was 23, a young engineer in training who had returned home to San Diego after further education. They met through a mutual friend who worked at the same salon where MJ was working as an apprentice. Robert had come to pick up his sister who was getting her hair done for a formal event, and he caught MJ's eye across the reception desk, clean-cut, dark-haired, leaning slightly on the counter with a mixture of confidence and calculation. There was something intense about him. They talked, briefly at first, about his job, her work at the salon, the unusually warm weather. He asked for her number, and to her surprise, she gave it. Not because he was overly charming. In fact, he was a little stiff. But there was something intriguing about him. Their first date was to a local diner on a Friday night. Nothing flashy, just coffee, a slice of pie, and a conversation that somehow didn't run out. He told her about his work and how his specialist field of engineering was about to change everything. She listened with quiet intrigue, asking intelligent and thoughtful questions. She then spoke about her dreams, her desire to be more than just somebody's wife. He told her that he admired her. They began seeing each other regularly. Weekend dates, long drives up to the coast, moments at the beach in Point Loma. MJ's friends liked Robert, but some quietly wondered if he was too serious for her. MJ liked his structure though. It made her feel safe, or at least like there was a plan. And for a young woman raised in the shadows of wartime and hardship, a plan sounded familiar. They married young in 1954 with a small ceremony in San Diego. At first, they lived in a modest apartment and tried to build something solid. Robert got work with an aerospace firm, and MJ left the beauty world for the time being to become a homemaker. A year later, in 1955, the beginnings of the Jenner Kardashian dynasty would be born. Kris was born a year after their marriage, in November of 1955. Their early years as parents were marked by hope and strain in equal measure. MJ stayed busy with the baby in the household. Robert worked long hours, leading to an increase in his heavy drinking habits. There were moments of closeness, the newness of family, the warmth of first Christmases, but also weeks of distance, arguments, late returns home from work. An invisible wall was starting to form. Kris, even as a child, picked up on the heavy emotional weight that began to press down on the household. Like many men of the time, the pressures of work, marriage, and fatherhood began to overwhelm Robert, resulting in anger and likely depression. There are varied sources on whether Robert's mental health issues manifested into physical violence, but we do know the pair's relationship became irreparable. Their second child, Karen, Kris's younger sister, arrived in 1958, just as the cracks were beginning to show in Mary Jo and Robert's marriage. By then, MJ was juggling more, a toddler at her feet, a baby in her arms, and a husband who was growing more distant by the week. Kris, even as a little girl, was said to be watchful, observant, and she quickly stepped into the role of a big sister with pride. Karen had a quieter temperament than Kris. Where Kris was energetic, Karen was softer, more reserved. MJ often described them as night and day, one drawn to the spotlight, the other more at ease in the background. But, despite their differences, they shared the sacred bond of sisters. By 1962, when Kris was 7 and Karen was 4, the marriage had unraveled and they divorced. MJ took custody of the children, moved into a smaller apartment, and began working again, this time selling children's clothes to make ends meet. Robert drifted further out of the picture. As the girls grew, they began to lean on each other in different ways. Kris, always more socially driven and ambitious, often helped take care of Karen while MJ was working. They were close in childhood, although their paths would diverge more dramatically as adults. Karen never entered the world of social media or business the way Kris did. She lived a quieter life, working at times as a nurse and mostly staying out of the spotlight. Over the years, her relationship with Kris had reportedly been up and down, close at some points, distant at others, but always threaded with that complex fabric of shared history. Both girls attended Claremont High School. Claremont wasn't a private institution. It was a public high school tucked into the suburban sprawl of post-war Southern California. Even as a teenager, Kris stood out, not just for her looks, though she was often described as striking, with her big brown eyes and natural confidence, but she was said to stand out for her presence. She had charisma. She was bubbly, quick-witted, and, as many classmates later recalled, already carried herself like a grown woman who had places to be. Kris was very popular in school. She had a wide social circle, moved easily between friend groups, and had a knack for making people feel seen. Some described her as the kind of girl who knew everyone and remembered everyone's name. She wasn't a classic overachiever in the academic sense. She didn't have a reputation for straight A's, but she had a mature grasp of social dynamics that far exceeded her years. She was a cheerleader, involved in school events, and known for dressing well. Stylish, polished, even in a sea of bell-bottom jeans and denim jackets. She'd borrow her mother's pieces, always putting together ensembles that looked more sophisticated than her peers. There are no widely circulated anecdotes from her Claremont classmates that have formally been published, but in later interviews, Kris hinted that her teenage years were full of energy and curiosity. She often reminisced about being boy crazy, not in a reckless way, but in an innocuous way that felt excitingly liberating. Friends said she had a way of commanding attention without asking for it, and she was magnetic, the kind of girl people gravitated toward. Around this time, MJ, her mother, remarried to Harry Shannon, a businessman who brought more comfort to their lives. He was warm and encouraging. Kris often credited Harry with being a stabilizing presence during her adolescence. She even began using his last name for a while, becoming Kris Shannon, throughout most of her teenage years. After graduating high school in 1973, Kris didn't immediately go to college. She had other plans. She had been working part-time as a flight attendant for American Airlines, most likely drawn to the structured glamour. Polished uniforms, tidy schedules, and new places. It suited her, and it gave her the chance to extend her education in people, how to talk to them, how to read them. The job was demanding. Long hours, occasional turbulence, tight quarters with strangers, but Kris liked the movement. She liked having her own money, and she liked the high standard that came with the expectation to always be composed. Kris also had a growing interest in fashion. Even when money was tight, she knew how to make things look cohesive. She learned how to sew and alter outfits herself. She spent hours studying the way women dressed, not just what they wore, but how they carried the outfit and what it said. By the mid-1970s, Kris was stepping into her 20s with momentum. The home she had grown up in, modest, at times uncertain, had taught her to always keep an eye on what came next. These skills served her well, not only as a young woman navigating adult life, but as someone drawn towards ambition. In this time period, Kris's social world began expanding too. She was moving in new circles, mingling with lawyers, athletes, entrepreneurs, actors. It was in this era, still in her early 20s, that she first crossed paths with a man named Robert Kardashian. He was older than her, by more than a decade. Smart, composed, and already successful, their casual meeting would give Jenner a grounded energy she didn't know she needed. A third-generation Armenian American, Robert had grown up in Los Angeles and gone on to earn his law degree from the University of San Diego. By the time they had met, he was practicing law and had co-founded a music and marketing company, dabbling in business ventures that gave him both influence and independence. They met through mutual friends, and their connection was instant, not loud, but enchanting. For Kris, Robert represented something steady, solid. He was a man who had plans, who knew the law, who dressed well, and carried himself with a calm sense of purpose. She admired that, and he, in turn, was captivated by her presence. The way she laughed, the way she listened, the way she seemed both glamorous and rooted at the same time. They began dating in the mid-70s. Their early relationship moved quickly, but it was marked by real affection, and for Kris, it felt like a turning point, not just in romance, but in the story she wanted to tell with her life. She could see the outlines of a future here, a home, a sense of arrival. And soon, that life began to take shape. Their early relationship was uncomplicated in its charm. He took her to dinners where she met people from a different world. Attorneys, executives, well-connected families who vacationed in Palm Springs and had alumni ties to USC. For Kris, it was new, but not intimidating. She understood people in an instant and could move easily through unfamiliar spaces. Robert admired this about her. She wasn't simply pretty or polite. She could hold her own in conversation, could ask questions that implied she'd been listening. They dated for a few years before getting engaged. He maintained his stillness, and while Kris was still young, she wasn't impulsive. The decision to marry him wasn't as a result of infatuation. It was a considered move. She saw a comfortable life with him, not just because of what he could provide, but because of how he moved through the world, calm, methodical, and secure. Those qualities appealed to her, as it had her mother. They got married on the 8th of July, 1978, in a traditional Armenian ceremony surrounded by friends and family. She was 22, he was 34. Marriage brought with it a shift in rhythm. They settled into a life of aspiration. They bought a home in Beverly Hills. In 1979, they welcomed their first child, Courtney. Kris was 24. Motherhood suited her, not in an overly sentimental way, but in how it gave her something to direct her energies to. She applied the same kind of attention she had once given her airline schedule to bottles, nap routines, baby clothes. Not long after, Kim was born, in 1980, followed by Chloe in 84 and Rob, the youngest, in 1987. Their house was often busy, not chaotic but full. Robert worked long hours and Kris managed the social and domestic side. She kept a tight calendar, made time for playdates and church, stayed close with her mother, MJ, who remained a present and helping figure in the children's lives. Kris was attentive, but not insular. Even as a young mother, she remained engaged with the world outside her front door. She went to gym classes, ran errands in heels, stayed curious about fashion, interiors, and lifestyle trends. She began to understand the appeal of appearances, not just as vanity, but as a kind of currency. The way you carried yourself, the way your home smelled, the way your children were dressed, it all communicated something. Through the 1980s, Kris built a life that was, from the outside, enviable. 4 children, a secure marriage, a well-kept home in a world-revered zip code. But underneath the smooth routine, things were changing. Robert's work became more consuming, and as the children got older, Kris felt a subtle shift in herself, a curiosity about life beyond her current role. She was still young, still alert, and moments of restlessness began to plague her thoughts, not in a dramatic fashion, but like a reoccurring itch you can't quite oust. An unsettling intrusion of peace kept circulating in her mind. Is this it? As far as we're aware, she never said it out loud. Not in those words. However, it lingered, especially in the quiet afternoons when the house was clean, kids napping, sunlight beaming through the polished French doors. It left residues of doubt throughout the Beverly Hills family home, and though the life she had was beautiful, part of her story felt unfinished. By the late 80s, Kris Jenner's life was neatly arranged. 4 children under 10, a husband with a prominent legal career, and a home that projected warmth and aspiration. She was known in her community, stylish, capable, the kind of woman who could host a birthday party without breaking a sweat. She kept routines tight. Mornings began with school runs, afternoons held errands and calls, and evenings often brought dinner with friends or the familiar sound of bathwater running upstairs. But as the years passed, the feeling of fullness in her life continued to fester, not because anything was obviously wrong, but because something inside her had started to flicker. That restlessness, faint at first, became harder to ignore. Robert, by this point, was deeply immersed in his work. He was co-founding different ventures, traveling often, and beginning to socialize in circles Kris did not always move in. They weren't drifting apart in a cinematic way. It was more ambient. The space between them began to feel like a silence rather than calm. Kris wasn't unhappy, but she was curious. She'd always had energy, a low hum that made her want to fix, to arrange, to do. She tried Pilates, charity committees, interior projects, but the sense that there was something missing, something next, waiting to be discovered, remained constant. She began spending more time out, lunches with friends, appointments that ran longer than planned, weekend outings. All of this gave her brief tastes of autonomy, perhaps tastes of freedom. It was around this time, in the early 1990s, that she met a man named Todd Waterman. He was younger than Robert, a former soccer player turned animator. Their affair didn't begin immediately, but the chemistry was undeniable. He was energetic, impulsive, someone who lived in the moment rather than planning 5 steps ahead. For Kris, whose life had been lived inside careful calendars and polite domesticity, it gave her a buzz of vitality, something that she'd been longing for. She later described the affair as a mistake, a choice made in a moment of emotional hunger. However, at the time, it had been intoxicating. Todd had paid attention to her, not as a mother or a wife, but as a woman. He saw the energy in her and mirrored it back. Their relationship was physical, thrilling, but ultimately unsustainable. Robert eventually found out. There was a confrontation, a private, painful, and unrelenting confrontation. He was hurt, and he did not hide it. The betrayal cut him deep. He had loved her, provided for her, built a life with her, and a social standing around her, and now that foundation had cracked. They separated not long after. The divorce was finalised in 1991, and it was the first major rupture in Kris's adult life. She was 36, alone for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The home was quieter, the calendar less predictable, and safety net gone. But of course, Kris Jenner did not collapse. She adjusted, quickly. That's something Kris has always done. Adapt, reframe, re-enter. She and Robert remained close, bound by the children and a long history. He was a present father, even after the separation, and they kept birthdays and holidays steady for the kids. There was a dignity to how they managed the divorce. In this period of transition, Kris found herself beginning again. She started dating socially, re-entering the world, not as a wife, but as a single mother of 4. She leaned on friends, on her mother, MJ, and threw herself back into routines with more precision than ever. If things were falling apart in one area, she knew how to double down in another. What few people saw during this time was how Kris kept her own household afloat. Robert had money, but Kris wasn't just relying on that. She began learning more about how to manage finances, about investments, about how influence moved, not just through money, but through relationships. She watched how the right lunch, the right favour, the right introduction could open up a door, and as always, she made mental notes. By 1993, the media was beginning to shift. Tabloid culture was heating up, celebrity coverage was becoming more aggressive, and the internet was only but a faint hum in the distance. Kris didn't know it yet, but her ability to navigate this world would eventually become her legacy. That year, she met somebody new, a former Olympian named Kris Jenner. It started as a friendship and grew from there. Bruce was quiet, family-orientated, and had recently been through his own divorce. He wasn't part of the Hollywood machinery. He was, in many ways, the opposite of everything Kris had been drawn to before. Less polished, more relaxed, but something about him felt right. Kris was finally ready to rebuild. Kris didn't enter her relationship with Bruce Jenner with naivety. By 1993, she had already lived a life that tested her adaptability. Marriage, motherhood, divorce. There was something disarming about Bruce. He moved through the world differently, quieter, less performative. And Kris, who had spent much of her adult life anticipating needs, filling spaces, and keeping things running, found the contrast refreshing. Bruce was also healing. His career had already peaked, at least in the traditional sense. A gold medalist at the 1976 Olympics, he had once been known as the greatest athlete in the world. But by the early 90s, he was more a memory than a headline. He had dabbled in motivational speaking, small television roles, and brand work, but nothing with permanence. His marriage to actress Linda Thompson had ended a few years earlier, and he was now focused on raising their 2 sons, Brandon and Brody. When Kris entered his life, she did so with energy. She wasn't just a partner, she was a presence. Within months, their lives began folding into one another. He moved into her home, and their children, hers from Robert, his from Linda, were cautiously introduced. It was not seamless. Blending two families rarely is. There were different routines, different parenting styles, different rhythms. But Kris approached it with the same deliberate focus she'd once brought to hosting, homemaking, and flight schedules. If something was off, she adjusted. If something needed more attention, she gave it. Slowly, the pieces began to fit. Their relationship gained momentum quickly. In spring of 1991, shortly after her divorce from Robert was finalised, they married in a quiet ceremony. She wore a sleek white mini dress and carried white orchids. The guest list was small, the press unaware. The start of a new chapter. Financially, things were tight. Bruce wasn't bringing in significant income, and Kris's own funds were limited. The security she'd known during her marriage to Robert was gone, but Kris, always alert to opportunity, saw potential in Bruce's legacy. He was a former icon, a name people remembered, even if they no longer followed. She believed there was a way to reframe his career, not by forcing a return to athletics, but by shaping a new public identity. She started making calls, reaching out to old contacts, looking for endorsements, speaking engagements, anything that could reintroduce Bruce in a meaningful way. She wasn't managing him in an official capacity, not yet, but the seeds were being sown. And in the process, Kris discovered something important. She was good at this. She had instinct, drive, and an ability to read the energy of a room. More importantly, she knew how to sell a narrative. At home, the family was growing. Kendall was born in 1995, followed by Kylie in 97. The age gap between her youngest daughters and her older children created a unique dynamic. Courtney, Kim, Chloe, and Rob were teenagers by then. Whilst Kendall and Kylie cooed in car seats, it made for a full house. Bedrooms were constantly reshuffled, bathrooms shared and contested. There was always something cooking or spilling or being searched for under the sofa or couch cushions. Kris thrived in the chaos. She had a system for everything: school pickups, dentist appointments, packed lunches. The refrigerator was always stocked, of course, and the calendars colour-coded, the holidays themed. But beyond the logistics, she understood that sentiment was being made here, that the way she curated home life would someday shape how her children remembered their childhood. But even as her focus remained on her family, Kris continued to yearn for something larger. She was building a household, yes, but she was also building a brand. She just didn't know it yet. Kim, in particular, had started to show signs of the charisma Kris herself had carried at that age. She was photogenic, poised, and already attentive to clothes, cameras, and possessed the kind of presence they required. Kris noticed it. There was something there. Meanwhile, Bruce's public profile remained dormant. Despite Kris's efforts, the media had largely moved on. This didn't deter her. She understood that visibility came in waves. Timing mattered. Until that wave returned, she focused on the infrastructure. She casually studied the building of professional relationships, paid attention to how the press worked, and how celebrities maintained relevance. And all the while, popular culture was evolving. Cable television was expanding. The internet was starting to pierce the edges of everyday life. Reality TV was still in its infancy, still niche, seen as entertainment's side project. But Kris, a woman who had spent her whole life watching for patterns, could feel something forming. A new kind of fame and visibility, not built on talent necessarily or legacy, but on access, familiarity, and family. By the early 2000s, Kris Jenner's household was running at full tilt. Her older children were entering adulthood, forming their own identities, navigating school, friendships, early jobs, while Kendall and Kylie were still young enough to need her daily presence. The energy inside the house was consistent. Teenagers spilled in and out of the front door, friends gathered in the kitchen, phones rang often. There were quiet stretches too, afternoons when everyone was out, when she'd find herself alone in a spotless house, candle burning, and a moment to sit before the next thing. Kris liked being busy. She'd always been someone who moved through the day with intention, not necessarily rushing, but never idle. She ordered gift wrap in bulk. She never let the holiday decorations go up late. She composed a domestic choreography that gave her life structure. However, the feeling that something bigger was on the horizon began to grace Kris's gut. Kim, in particular, had begun orbiting in new circles. She'd started working as a closet organizer and stylist, primarily for celebrities. At first, it had been casual, a friend of a friend asking for help with a wardrobe. But Kim's attention to detail and her understanding of image quickly earned her a reputation. She was soon helping to manage and curate closets for figures like Paris Hilton, whose lifestyle and media presence were closely watched. This was a new world, one where visibility was currency and influence could grow without traditional fame. Kim was curious, ambitious, and not afraid of the camera. Kris watched all of this with interest and cautious calculation. She could see that the attention swirling around Kim was not random. It had shape. And if it had shape, it could be steered. Reality television was gaining traction. The Osbournes had premiered on MTV in 2002, showing the public that there was an appetite for unscripted family life. The mess, the warmth, the unique dynamic. It wasn't elegant or polished, but it was watchable, addictive even. She also paid attention to the press, not just the headlines, but the placement of stories. Who and what got front page treatment, which stories were buried. She started to understand that celebrity status wasn't only about talent, but, perhaps more importantly, about narrative control. By the mid-2000s, the Kardashian name was beginning to circulate. Kim's friendship with Paris Hilton gave her access to events, photographers, and parties where media presence was strong. Kris remained deeply involved in the background. She wasn't managing her daughter's career in an official capacity yet, but she was present and watched who approached them. Who asked for photos, who didn't. She noticed the subtle hierarchy of social scenes and began to see where opportunities might live. And an opportunity was just around the corner. In 2007, a private tape of Kim and her then boyfriend, Ray J, famous R&B singer, was leaked. The media storm was immediate, invasive, relentless. For many, it might have been the end of a public life. For Kris, it was something else. She was furious, yes. Protective of her daughter's dignity, yes. But also pragmatic. She understood with unsettling clarity that the story was already out. The only question left was how to tell it. Who controlled the narrative? Kris moved quickly, hiring publicists and consulting lawyers. She looked at how other celebrities had weathered similar storms and did something few would have considered. She reframed the attention not as a scandal, but as spotlight. If people were going to look, then they might as well see the whole family. She began pitching a show, one that followed the lives of her children, herself, Bruce, the younger girls, a real family full of contrasts. Teenagers, toddlers, co-parents, step-parents. She knew it was watchable. Not because they were perfect, but because they were textured. The idea made its way to Ryan Seacrest, who was then expanding his production efforts. He saw the potential too and greenlit the project. Within months, cameras were installed in the family home, and Keeping Up with the Kardashians was premiered on E! In October 2007. It wasn't an instant hit. Early reviews were mixed, even dismissive. But it found an audience fairly quickly. The show was fast, chaotic, oddly intimate. It let viewers in not only to the bedrooms and kitchens, but into arguments, reconciliations, plans, mistakes, and at the centre of it all was Kris. Sometimes frantic, sometimes funny, often overlooked, but always present. She was both character and conductor. On screen, she was the matriarch, balancing teenage tantrums with toddler meltdowns. Off screen, she was the producer, managing logistics, handling the network, fielding press. The show was technically unscripted, but Kris knew how to shape an episode, how to nudge a storyline into place, how to keep scenes dynamic and filled with momentum. The public began to notice not just Kim, Khloe, and Kourtney, but Kris herself, the woman who had once organised flight schedules and fridge shelves was now managing a media empire. And for the first time, she was not just behind the scenes. She was a central figure. Her instincts, once domestic, were now commercial. She understood timing, tone, and scale. She knew how to steer a conversation, how to respond to controversy, how to pivot when necessary. Years of watching, hosting, and managing had sharpened her. By the end of the first season, Kris Jenner wasn't just the mother of a breakout star. She was building something much larger, a family business that was part production, part publicity, and part legacy. A brand rooted not in performance but in proximity. Not just in what the world saw, but in how often they saw it. By the time Keeping Up with the Kardashians had been renewed for its second season, the family's status had begun to advance, not just in public perception, but in the way Kris Jenner moved through the world. She was no longer orbiting fame, she was in its engine room. The show hadn't only captured attention, it had begun to define a new kind of cultural weather, less about Hollywood glamour and more about access. Behind the scenes, her role was growing sharper. She began managing each of her daughters in an official capacity. Contracts, press, endorsements, they all filtered through her. She didn't have formal background in this business, but she had a lived one. She watched men negotiate. She'd watched the cost of not asking for enough. The brand they were building was fueled by visibility. Daily, constant, near-invasive visibility. But where others might have burned out, Kris thrived and curated a perfect formula. She staggered stories, she paced the press. She began to understand the rhythm of digital attention, how to keep things just busy enough, just accessible enough, that people wanted to stay engaged. And she understood the emotional undertone too, that at the heart of it, people wanted a story they could invest in, a character to root for or against. Each daughter brought something different. Courtney had a cool detachment. Chloe was the relatable and funny counterweight to Kim's veneer. Rob was quieter, still present, but already resisting the limelight. Bruce, still Bruce, at this point, was visible too, often framed as the calm, grounding parent. And Kris was the operator, the one taking calls in the kitchen, holding clipboards at photo shoots, coordinating birthday parties with custom themes and media-ready guest lists. She kept the machine warm, even when the cameras weren't rolling. In 2009, Kim was offered a position to attend the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It was a striking moment, a kind of legitimization for the family. A symbolic moment that moved them beyond tabloid into today's zeitgeist. The Kardashian-Jenner name was still mocked in some circles, still dismissed by parts of the press, but at least they weren't being ignored. And for Kris, being underestimated had always been a familiar advantage. The empire was growing, and endorsements became a large part of everyday life. Weight loss teas, fashion lines, beauty products. Kris strategically negotiated the deals on behalf of her daughters, and she was thinking long term. Brand extensions, licensing, ownership. In 2010, the family launched Kardashian Glamour Tan, followed by a series of clothing lines, including the Kardashian collection with Sears. The ventures weren't always critically acclaimed, but they sold, and Kris was watching the numbers. That same year, the family moved into a new home in Hidden Hills. Larger, more secluded, better suited for filming too. The house was a set and a sanctuary all at once. It had space for everyone. Filming days now ran smoothly. Holidays looked more cinematic, and Kris had more room to work. Literally and figuratively. She began operating from a home office that doubled as a nerve center. Folders, whiteboards, call sheets. There were still personal dynamics to manage. Her marriage to Bruce, though outwardly steady, had become more complex. They operated more like business partners than husband and wife. He was still filming, still present, but Kris could feel the gap growing between them. Different needs, different speeds. She focused on the children, the brand, the next opportunity, and Bruce, often quieter, receded somewhat into the background. The children were also growing more independent. Kim was leading campaigns. Chloe and Courtney had spun off into their own show, Courtney and Chloe Take Miami. In 2011, Kris released a memoir, Kris Jenner and All Things Kardashian, her version of the story. She wrote about her upbringing, her marriages, her mistakes. She wrote about Robert, about the affair, about building something from a rupture. And people read it. She wasn't positioning herself as a flawless matriarch. She was positioning herself as someone who had seen the underbelly of glamour and still chose to step forward. That same year, Kim married NBA player Kris Humphries in a highly televised ceremony. The wedding, lavish, white-drenched, televised as a 2-part special, became one of the highest-rated episodes in the show's history. The marriage, however, lasted only 72 days. The backlash was swift. Accusations of the wedding being staged, doubts about sincerity. Kris Jenner was once again placed under scrutiny. She did what she always did, stayed calm, strategic, and steered the press towards the idea of heartbreak, of human error. As always, the storm passed. Kris's ability to weather criticism and repurpose it became one of her defining traits. She didn't resist the narrative, she just rolled with it. And as she did, she built something that was no longer just a show or a brand. She built a cultural infrastructure. The Kardashian Jenners weren't a moment, they were becoming an industry. By 2012, the Kardashian Jenner world had become an ecosystem. Television, product lines, magazine covers, appearances, each piece fed into the next. Kris oversaw all of it, often from the same kitchen counter where dinner plans were being finalized. Her presence on Keeping Up with the Kardashians remained steady, but much of her work now happened off camera. Meetings, contract negotiations, licensing deals. The family brand was no longer a novelty. There was a structure to how the empire moved. Filming schedules were mapped across school terms and fashion weeks. Photo shoots were planned to align with product launches. Social media, still relatively new, was becoming a tool of control. Kris encouraged each of her daughters to use it strategically, not to post everything, but to post with intention. A handbag placement, a birthday message, a caption that sparked conversation. In public, the family maintained a curated version of closeness, but privately, things were becoming strained. Bruce, who had once been the stable counterweight in the family, was becoming withdrawn. Their marriage now felt more like cohabitation than partnership. They began spending more time apart, separate routines, trips. When they were together, it was often for the sake of filming or the children. Kris focused on what could be maintained, which happened to be the home, the brand. She kept filming, took meetings, and made an effort to stay public. But the space between them had become difficult to ignore. In October 2013, after over 2 decades together, Kris and Bruce announced their separation. The language was polite, but the feeling was heavy. Two people who had built a blended life were now moving in different directions. Their separation marked the beginning of a larger transformation, one that would soon shift not only their personal lives, but the public's perception of identity and family in a larger social context. In 2015, Bruce came forward as transgender. The transition was deeply personal, but also historic. Few public figures of Bruce's stature had spoken so openly about gender identity. The family had known privately for some time, but the public disclosure brought new weight. Bruce became Caitlyn. For Kris, Caitlyn's transition was layered. She had supported Bruce through decades of reinvention, athlete, speaker, father, and now she was facing the reality of a marriage that had ended in ways she couldn't have predicted. There were interviews, misunderstandings, a televised special, and eventually a memoir from Caitlyn that described their relationship in terms Kris didn't entirely recognize. Amid all this, Kris kept the machine running. Her daughters were growing in their own lanes, launching apps, fashion lines, cosmetic brands. Kendall's modelling career had taken off. Kylie had begun experimenting with lip products. Kim was entering the world of high fashion, aligning herself with designers and increasingly with Kanye West. Kris handled the moving parts. She brokered deals, fielded press, moderated tension. She was still filming, still appearing, still doing the everyday work of motherhood, but her role had become more executive than maternal. She was thinking in terms of longevity, protecting each daughter's public arc, repositioning the family after Caitlyn's transition, ensuring that no moment, celebratory or difficult, moved too far outside of her influence. In 2015, Kylie launched Kylie Lip Kits. The first drop sold out in minutes. Kris had been involved in the process from start, overseeing packaging, distribution, customer service. She saw the potential immediately. The business was small at first, but scalable. She helped form the company, Kylie Cosmetics, and began laying the groundwork for expansion. Within 2 years, the brand was generating hundreds of millions in sales. This was no longer about reality television. It was about product empires, brand architecture, intellectual property. Kris brought on legal teams, partnered with factories, reviewed analytics. She wasn't experimenting anymore, but executing brand management of the highest level. The public image of Kris continued to evolve. CEO, media strategist, someone who had turned her family into a global name and had done so while weathering divorces, scandals, online mockery, and cultural skepticism. She was still part of the show, still occasionally the punchline, but also increasingly the mastermind behind the scenes. By 2017, the Kardashian-Jenner landscape had shifted entirely. The daughters now moved through the world with security. Paparazzi followed them internationally. Brands tailored campaigns around their social media calendars, and Kris, always at the center, kept her own calendar full. Home remained important. The family still gathered for birthdays and decorated for holidays. She still called MJ every day, and she still made sure the refrigerators were stocked and the gift wrap was ordered. But she was also preparing for the next iteration, because by now, Kris recognized public attention never stays still, and staying relevant wasn't a matter of luck, it was a matter of planning. By the late 2010s, Kris Jenner had built a system with its own gravity. Her daughters were no longer just television personalities, but now businesswomen, brand ambassadors, and cultural icons. Each had carved out a space, a niche, and behind them, coordinating schedules, negotiating contracts, reading quarterly reports in the same breath as group texts about table settings, was Kris Jenner. In 2017, Kylie Cosmetics surged into the mainstream. The lip kits had become emblematic, not just of Kylie's image, but of a larger trend. Direct-to-consumer celebrity branding. Kris had seen the early numbers, watched the stockpile dwindle, tracked the resale prices. She understood they had something far more potent than a product. She helped guide Kylie towards scaling it into a formal business, navigating manufacturing, licensing, and retail partnerships. By 2019, Coty Incorporated purchased a 51% stake in Kylie Cosmetics for $600 million. The deal was a media event, and Kris had overseen every phase. Meanwhile, Kim was now a dominant force in beauty and fashion, with KKW Beauty, Skims, collaborations with major designers, and several Vogue covers. Khloe had launched Good American. Kourtney was leaning towards wellness. Kendall had positioned herself inside the fashion industry, not just as a celebrity model, but as somebody who brands always wanted on the runway. Keeping Up with the Kardashians continued to air season after season. However, the tone was slicker now. Storylines became more thematic. As social media absorbed more of the day-to-day updates, the show became a container for longer arcs, pregnancies, weddings, breakups, and behind-the-scene glimpses of the business. She also knew when to pivot. In 2020, the family announced that Keeping Up would come to an end after 20 seasons. It had been over a decade. Children had grown up on screen. Relationships had begun and ended. Fame and the world alike had changed. But without sentiment, Kris continued to look forward. That same year, she inked a deal with Hulu for a new series, The Kardashians. A new format, better control, better ownership. The family would remain on screens just under a new structure that they had helped to shape. Off screen, Kris's personal life had settled into something more private. Her relationship with Corey Gamble, which began in the mid-2010s, remained steady, largely outside of storylines. He travelled with her often, attended events, helped to coordinate logistics. He was present, but rarely central, a quiet, calming figure in a life that rarely paused. Her connection to her children remained close. She kept birthdays special, gathered everyone for holidays, and always checked in on who was overwhelmed or overscheduled. She remained part executive, part mother, and family historian. And yet, even as her daughters became moguls in their own right, she never quite stepped back. As much as she continued to negotiate and schedule, she also reminded them to rest, to stay alert, and always remember the power of privacy. As we move into the 2020s, the public perception of the Kardashian Jenners had morphed again. The perception of them as accidental celebrities had been overpassed by their power, their cultural influence, and Kris Jenner was finally being recognized for her genius. Think pieces no longer asked who she was or how she got here. They dissected her strategy and patience while praising her ability to pull focus when it mattered and redirect it when it didn't. Today, Kris Jenner exists as more than a celebrity. She's become a cultural archetype. To some, she is the ultimate momager, a term she trademarked and redefined, symbolizing a new kind of matriarchal power rooted in media savvy, emotional fluency, and financial precision. Her name evokes a specific blend of luxury, strategy, and maternal stewardship. A woman who turned family life into a monetized empire without ever losing sight of sentiment or aesthetics. She's regularly referenced in pop culture as a shorthand for ambition cloaked in softness, power behind the curtain. That now iconic scene from Keeping Up with the Kardashians, where Kris leans into a camcorder and tells Kim, "You're doing amazing, sweetie," has become a meme, a mantra, a symbol of unwavering and sometimes absurd maternal branding. In recent years, she's been spoofed on Saturday Night Live, profiled in the New York Times, and invited to speak at business summits alongside Fortune 500 executives. Her 2021 cameo in Meghan Trainor's music video, Mother, where she lip-syncs the lyrics in full glam and pearls, became an instant viral moment, not only because it was ironic, but because it felt inevitable. She had earned that symbolism. The woman who once cold-called stylists and network executives from her home office was now being asked to personify matriarchy itself. She no longer only was seen as the manager behind the Kardashians. She is viewed as the architect of modern celebrity commerce, with a career that quietly reshaped how fame is created, sustained, and inherited.